Welcome back to our PPE in a Time of Pandemic discussion series. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Professor Adam Hosein of Northeastern University, who is the author of The Ethics of Migration, a book published in 2018 with Routledge, as well as several important articles on the subject of immigration. So we're going to talk about immigration regulations and the pandemic. Adam, I'd like to start by discussing how normative considerations around migration interplay with public health considerations before moving to focus on some more specific questions motivated by very, very recent policy changes. In particular, I'd like to address how your philosophical research informs your impression of recent events in the United States, including some executive orders to restrict skilled migration and to suspend certain sorts of green card processing, as well as a very recent ruling by ICE, which imposes targeted restrictions on international students studying at American universities. But let's start with a few questions about the relationship of public health and migration policy more broadly. Okay, so many theorists who are otherwise in favor of open borders are happy to make exceptions to their principled opposition in the name of public health. So what do you think about border closures in the time of COVID, not just in America, but in countries like New Zealand and Australia, for example? So what special ethical justification could be afforded to border controls aimed at preventing the spread of disease?
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you, everyone. So the conceptual point I would make, if you like, is that there's a tendency here to think about border controls as special, to think that COVID is a kind of immigration problem. And so we need to distinguish between immigration, understood as the movement of people across national borders, especially people who intend to settle in a new place, and just the movement of people in general. So immigration is just a species of the movement of people, which can happen within a country, within a district, just across streets. And the issue of COVID transmission is one of the movement of people. And so the reason that sometimes open borders folks say, well, at least some restrictions on immigration might be okay, is that they think, well, if it's okay to restrict somebody, telling them they have to stay in their own home within their neighborhood, or it's permissible to tell somebody they have to stay within their district, or 30 miles radius of their home or something like that, then sure, it's also okay to potentially restrict migration across borders. So you should just see these immigration restrictions as standing or falling on the same considerations that would come into play when you're thinking about these other kinds of restrictions on movement. And there's going to be a tendency to assume that immigration is the real problem, but in practice, that's often not going to be the case. So I live here in Massachusetts. We are doing comparatively well now from where we were in April. Our cases are down like 90%, something like that. And at this point, the risk of someone moving here from Arizona is probably more than the risk of someone moving here from Madrid. So we shouldn't think, so just to see the general point that you should take each case as it comes and see when are restrictions on movement justified, and not think, does COVID mean we need to shut down borders in particular and treat that in isolation. I hope that made some sense. There's some more things to say about the relationship between public health and immigration policy in general. One thing to say is that migrants are often essential workers. If you looked at, so Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he contracted COVID and in fact was hospitalized. And if you saw the two nurses who were with him through the night when he was on a respirator were both migrants. And that's reflective of a general trend that healthcare workers are often migrants. People who work in other essential services are often migrants. And so restrictions on immigration can be bad for public health because they prevent countries from having access to those workers. And then there's another way in which restrictions on migration can interact with public health, which is at the level of enforcement. So Trump administration has frequently tried various strategies for ramping up internal enforcement, as we call it, which is to say, basically ramping up deportation or trying to make it harder for undocumented people to live in this country so that they, according to the policy, hopefully leave. And so those are attempts to restrict migration through internal rather than external enforcement, but they are often quite problematic from a public health perspective because undocumented, there's a bunch of data. Tiffany Joseph here in Boston, for example, has shown that health-seeking behavior on the part of migrants reflects the degree of threat they're under of deportation. You're much less likely to interact with various public institutions or even to leave your house if you are constantly under threat of deportation. There are some things that can be done. So in Boston, the city has tried to make access to COVID testing easier so that you don't have to show any kind of documentation for that. That helps. But there's still, this was an issue pre-COVID of this health-seeking behavior and various diseases that are comorbid with COVID will still be affected by health-seeking behavior that's totally unrelated to testing for COVID and so on. So there are a number of kind of intersections between migration policy and public health policy that aren't just to do with the way that I think a lot of people will naturally think of it, which is there are these immigrants, they carry the disease, they need to be kept out, and so I would try to complicate that picture in a variety of ways.
I want to ask a question more broadly about immigration and partiality. So do you think that partiality considerations towards citizens supply legitimate grounds for governments to formulate immigration policy? And furthermore, do you think it's legitimate for citizens to use partiality towards their co-citizens as considerations in favor of supporting certain immigration policies over others as voters?
Yeah, so I do have a more direct answer to that question, but I want to kind of stand back from it for a second to say that so there's a fair amount of literature and people asking, is it in principle permissible for states to show partiality towards their citizens or individual citizens to show partiality towards their co-citizens? And people have kind of assumed that a lot turns on that they've assumed that once you say there are these either obligations of partiality or at least there's permissible partiality, that you end up saying, okay, so now the question is, how many immigrants should the state let in? And then you see, well, where's the tipping point where there's too much kind of costs being imposed on the domestic population? And I have tried to sort of avoid that debate to some degree, although I have views on that. I've tried to avoid that to some degree by trying to show that even if you grant that states maybe have some kinds of special responsibility to their own citizens, or at least their own members of their society, let's say, I don't think it's really citizenship that should be the right trigger. You can still justify a lot more immigration than we currently have. And so you don't necessarily need to answer that very foundational question. And I could say a little bit more about why I think that, if you like.
Yeah, that'd be great, yeah.
So just to kind of give us an example. So one thing people say is supposedly problematic about immigration is its economic impact. There are different things they point to. They maybe say that immigration is problematic because of it, by their lights, suppresses wages or has some effect on public finances. For example, by making it harder to sustain the welfare state, something like that. So that's really, there are a bunch of further questions that we need to ask if somebody makes an argument like that. So the obvious first question is, well, is it true that immigration affects wages? The data suggests, especially, so the people usually that get picked on in that context is lower skilled workers, and it seems the majority of the data suggests that there really isn't an effect. But even the people who think there is an effect, for example, George Borjas at Harvard would be probably the most famous person to say there's an effect. It's really not that much. But then you might say, well, okay, what sounds like $1,000 to you or me per year doesn't sound like a lot, or maybe it does. It's a lot, but it doesn't seem like the difference between life and death as it might be for some very poor migrants. But even there, there's more to say about the interests of the domestic worker, because really you don't care just about people's wages per se, you care about their overall economic well-being. And so you shouldn't just see immigration policies in isolation, you need to see them as part of a broader package of economic policies. And so if it's the case that immigration does depress wages somewhat, but still expands the economy overall, then you can use some of that money, some of those resources that you get from the expanded economy to compensate the people who are losing out wage-wise, if they lose out at all. And then I think, and then that seems even more, that point is even more persuasive if you think, and then this is obviously a further set of questions, if you think that the state is it's already incumbent on the state to have some redistributive scheme in place in the first place. So if that's right, then when someone says, hey, the state's letting in too many immigrants, they're depressing wages, the right thing to say is, no, the problem is that the state is failing to do this other thing that's morally required to do, which is to have a reasonable redistributive system. And so that's quite apart from migration. So there are a lot of kind of moving pieces there. I mean, another, not totally parallel, but related point about for example, people talk about the effect of migration on culture. There too, that it raises this whole host of further questions. So one is, well, what's the actual impact of migration? Is it true that migrants change the culture in any way? The second question is, well, what do you mean by culture? If you mean preserving a white country, that's obviously not going to be a relevant consideration. In fact, it's a impermissible consideration. If you mean just preserving a community where people share some basic knowledge of history and things like that, that might be something that again would be addressed not through your immigration policies but through your education policies. So I think there's a lot when someone says, oh, there are these obligations of partiality, and that's just the start of a much longer conversation about what the effects of immigration are, which of those effects actually count as being bad or good, and then insofar as if the effects do seem deleterious, is that really a problem that we should pin on immigration, or is that a problem that we should pin on other forms of injustice within the community? So I mean, to take another example, in the case of supposed effects on culture, people sometimes say, well, too much immigration creates kind of social tension. Well, it depends where that source of that is. If that's because there are migrants, and then the more migrants are visible within a community, the more discrimination there is, and hence that's like a source of tension, then the right way to address that is through anti-racism or anti-discrimination legislation, and not through restricting migration per se. Yeah, so that was kind of a long story, but I just wanted to kind of see that we shouldn't take this. I think a view that's natural to a lot of people, which is there's a trade-off between migrant rights and the rights of existing members, and the question is just how much do you weigh these versus these? I think that's too simplistic a story.
Well, can I follow up on that and keep pressing on the partiality thing by asking for your reaction to a recent argument made by the philosopher Johann Frick. So Frick argues that we can't use partiality. That would be dialectically illegitimate to use partiality as a basis to discriminate between citizens and migrants, because depending on what policies we adopt, one of the ways of going would be one where ultimately we would become partial to the migrants if they were to become citizens, and so it would be sort of something dialectically inappropriate about invoking partiality in these cases. What do you think about that line of thinking?
So to be fair to Frick, I haven't read his paper, so I don't want to. Okay. I want to rag on the guy without read his paper, but my first reaction to that argument is I have some concerns about it, because do you have like a mascot at UNC? So Northeastern, we're like the Huskies.
I mean the Tar Heels.
Tar Heels. All right.
I think it's a ram. The animal is.
right? So presumably somebody becomes a member of the UNC community and becomes like a Tar Heel. People will say like, oh, you're a Tar Heel now. We all like are partial. We have some partiality towards you. But
yeah,
it would be very odd for me to say like, well, if I joined UNC and became a Tar Heel, you would all call this partiality towards me. Therefore, you're obligated to admit me to UNC. That seems like, just more generally, it's the case that there are various relationships that generate partiality, but the fact that that partiality would be both de facto generated and kind of obligatory within that relationship doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get into that relationship. In fact, sometimes that might be a reason to avoid the relationship. Like maybe you think, well, if I adopted a child, like I would really have to, you know, I would have a bunch of new responsibilities, so I better kind of like take seriously whether I can fulfill them and whether I, you know, think I'm ready for that. You know, that seems like irrelevant. It would be strange to say, well, if I did adopt a child, I would have shown partiality, so I better adopt as many as I can immediately. You know, that seems like but you know, again, I haven't heard the full version of the argument. So,
well, let's turn from these sort of general, lofty philosophical questions to more down to earth, ripped from the headlines kinds of cases. And I wanted to ask you about DACA. So the Supreme Court, I think it was, I mean, it was very recently, maybe a month ago or so, had this ruling on DACA. And I was wondering what you thought about it and what your opinions about DACA was and the Supreme Court's ruling on DACA.
Yeah, so I don't know everybody who's here, so but just to make sure we're all on the same page. So DACA, there's a lot of details to it, but the basic idea was that if you are a kind of young adult in the United States and you were brought to the United States undocumented at a young age, under 16, I believe was the number, then you can get some kind of shield from deportation. You can a shield for 2 years, renewable. So so you had some degree of stability where you could rely on that. And so that was an Obama administration policy. President Obama tried to expand it a little bit towards the end of his term. And then the Trump administration tried to rescind it. And then what the Supreme Court said was that, very crudely, the court said that the Trump administration didn't offer a kind of good enough justification. They had to at least offer a kind of passable justification. This is a very crude description of the legal situation. And then they didn't. So DACA stands for the time being, but only for the time being. That leaves open the possibility that the Trump administration could come back and say, no, we've done a more thorough review, and we have a really good justification for rescinding DACA. So the situation as things, so that's all just to say that the situation as things stand for these undocumented people is still somewhat tenuous. They don't know whether that order will be rescinded, especially if President Trump is reelected. And then even DACA itself had some limitations. As I said, it didn't grant someone an indefinite right to remain in this country. There was no pathway to citizenship. It just said you get these 2 years and you can try to renew it at the end. And then the last thing to say is there were some limitations which were that, again, it only applies to people who were below a certain age and who came to the country at a certain age. So putting all that together, I was very glad to see that decision. I was in favor of DACA, and so I was glad that there was at least a little bit of a reprieve for those folks. But it's a slightly, it's not a cause for huge celebration because the situation still remains quite tenuous, and there's still a lot of people who aren't covered by DACA in the first place. So so that's on the kind of details of where we're at policy-wise. I think so. Going back just to kind of get an into how I see this issue philosophically. One point that Justice Roberts made was, he said, well, one reason why the government needs to have at least a passable justification, he said, was that there are quote unquote reliance interests here. There's this law and people have come to rely on it. They've come to plan their life somewhat around the expectation that they would be present for at least the full 2 year period. and this kind of pulls the rug under them. So why might that matter? And you might think, well, generally speaking, people have some quite important interests in being able to make plans that stretch out over time, that they don't just cover what they're going to do for dinner tonight, but they cover their real main life concerns. And then those plans are often kind of territorially based. It's very hard to say, I'm going to plan my career, I'm going to make a career plan, but not with any reflection on where I'll be living. I'll just, it'll be completely agnostic between being in the United States and Chile and France, where, so you have this important interest in making plans, and then especially in being able to make them in a somewhat territorially based way. Or, suppose you wanted to build a synagogue or a church or a mosque. Again, it's going to be built in a place. So your fundamental goals and plans in life need to be sometimes stretched out in time, and they need to be kind of tied to some kind of expectation of where they're going to be carried out. So that, I think, was lurking in the background. That was a much more complicated philosophical picture that I think was lurking in the background of something that Justice Roberts alluded to. But that more general idea applies not just to the potential rescinding or not rescinding of DACA for potentially not very good reasons, but to the whole issue of an amnesty in general. So all undocumented people in the country, in the absence of an amnesty, are potentially living here for a very long time. And there are quite a lot of, the estimates vary a lot, but there are probably about 11 million, 12 million undocumented people in this country. And they all live, as things stand, with some degree of uncertainty about their ability to make those kinds of plans. And so philosophically, I think it's a core liberal value. It's a value I think is often actually shared by libertarians and others, that if you're going to ask people to follow the laws laid down by the state needs to pay some respect to their ability to make these plans for themselves around the law. And so this is a very compressed version of, I think an argument for amnesties more generally. There are other arguments people have given for amnesties. Some people, that's the one that I favor. Some people say things like, the undocumented people have become Americans, and so they should be treated as Americans. The reasons I don't like that version, but the version I favor rests on these kinds of considerations about being able to make life plans for yourself and not living in constant fear of disruption.
I see. Yeah. Could you say a little bit more why you don't like the other argument about these people become Americans and that's why they should remain?
Sure. Yeah. I think it invites this question. Well, what is it to be an American? And that's typically, I think, a bad way to go about deciding who has what rights. Say, well, this person's an American, so they should get the right to, for any right, freedom of speech, right to access welfare, whatever it may be. The people who defend that argument will say, well, I have a very capacious notion of what it is to be an American. I certainly don't have an ethnic notion. I don't think it's tied to language use. I don't think it's tied to who you spend your time with. But at that point, I think, once you start to really thin it out to the point where it's just a matter of kind of living here, which is where it ends up being, then you're like, well, why does that matter so much, normatively speaking? And then I think you're back to saying something more like what I said, which is, well, it matters that you're living here because you're subject to the laws of the government, and then you need to be able to continue to make plans here and so on. So there's the kind of back and forth that you either have a very ethnicized or problematic notion of Americanness, otherwise problem, or you try to thin it out, but then I think you end up having to say something more like what I would say. That was very compressed.
That's very interesting. Do you think, does this view, so we're talking about immigration, but do you think this view then, or that kind of argument would expand to other kinds of policies? So like maybe tax policy or other kinds of laws the government could pass that would affect people's ability to do long-term planning. Like maybe I want to start a business, and so, but whether it would be a good idea for me or not depends on like what the interest rates would be, or how much I would have to pay in taxes in a number of years or something. And so would this argument also bear on what is justifiable, what kind of tax laws or what kinds of economic factors that government could put into place?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, I think this is a point that people more on the right, Hayek, for example, makes this point that some degree of stability in the content of the law is needed if you're to make plans for your life. And I agree with him on that. I think what he maybe missed in the tax case is that there are other things you need to be able to make stable plans than just knowing what the tax laws are going to be. And they might include, for example, having some resources, like having some stable property for yourself that is yours and you know it's yours and you know that no one's going to take that can be important for being able to make long-term plans and not just for the rich. It's true for everybody. So having that's some, so he wouldn't have he wasn't excited about redistribution, but I think that comes in.
Sort of switching back to talking about the pandemic for a second. One interesting feature of this sort of pandemic immigration policy is that many countries have decided to exclude certain groups from entry on the basis of citizenship or the country of origin. One worry about these exclusionary orders is that they might engage in some kind of racial profiling by other means. So some people have questioned like why the exclusions apply to citizens of country X, but not country Y, when the two states are in similar situations with respect to the virus. Or you had an example earlier on, which was a little bit different, but about comparing Spain to Arizona. And you have a recent article in which you present a new argument against racial profiling. So I was wondering if you could just explain to us what racial profiling is and how does what your argument about racial profiling is and how does it interact with new frontiers in immigration regulation?
Yeah, so the racial profiling thing that I wrote, the basic take, so racial profiling, what racial profiling is basically using racial criteria. People tend to use racial kind of broadly in this context. I mean, include racial, ethnic, religious, all kind of, so if you're, where you're, the usual case is deciding who to screen in the case of policing or in the case of at the airport or something like that, based on one of these racial characteristics in the capacious sense. So you screen somebody because they look black or because they look Muslim, because they're in some way appear to the officer to be Muslim. And then the question is when, if ever, is that okay? And you can have kind of explicit versions of it where there's like a formal policy that says, we concentrate our immigration enforcement on people who appear to be Latino. And then there's non-explicit versions of it where, despite the policy, an individual officer does it anyway, or and then this is the case that's more germane to the immigration context, where the policy on its face doesn't pick people out based on their race or ethnicity, but it's motivated by a desire to target people on those bases. So the question, so the way I try to frame it is you need to think about what the message is of some of these policies, and message is kind of an abstract idea, but I think you can give a relatively straightforward explanation of what that means in this context, which is just what can you infer from the outside about the motivations behind the policy. So for example, can you infer that the government, in the case of profiling of Black folks, that the government thinks that Black folks are inherently criminal or something like that? And the right question, I argue, is not just what do some people happen to infer, but what can you reasonably infer? Because if you just make some strange guess about what the government's up to, that give you a complaint. But if you, based on the evidence available to you, it seems like it's pretty plausible that the government is doing this because it thinks you're inherently criminal, or in the case of Muslims, that the government thinks Muslims are inherently disposed to terrorism or whatever it may be. Then you might have a serious complaint. I have more to say about why you have a complaint, but the basic idea is that there's something wrong about having to live in a society where you reasonably perceive the government as very hostile towards you, or having some demeaning conception of you. And that comes up, just to give you an example of how that kind of idea comes up in the immigration context. So if you take the Hawaii v. Trump case, so the official order at stake there singled out people based on their nationality. So it said, if you're, the precise list varied, Iraq kind of came on and off, and then, but if you're on one of the singled out countries, then your entry was restricted. So it didn't say anything about race or ethnicity or religion on its face. It just said nationality. But then there was this question, and President Trump said, well, oh, and I had this memorandum from the Department of Homeland Security that justified this, that said, these are the countries that need to be picked out because they're a security risk. And the court basically said, well, we'll take, again, very, very crudely, the court said, we should just, in this context at least, we should just take the president at his word. As long as the law doesn't on its face mention race or ethnicity or something like that, we should say, okay, we'll just trust him that this memorandum was genuine and was motivated by a genuine concern with security, and that's why he picked out these countries. But if you look at it in context, you know the history of the situation, that he while he was campaigning constantly referred to not a travel ban, but a Muslim ban. Donald J. Trump is calling for a complete and total shutdown on the entry of Muslims in the United States. And then even after he was in office, he said various things, like he said that he'd been basically asking his lawyers, is there a way for me to exclude Muslims without running into constitutional concerns? So you put all that together, it starts to look like, irrespective of what the law said on its face, it was reasonable for Muslims, people from Muslim backgrounds in this country, to think that it was really motivated by anti-Muslim bias, by Islamophobic sentiment. Then it looks a lot more problematic. And so in the public health case, I would say there too, what you need to look at is the surrounding context. So some distinctions aren't going to trigger major concerns of that kind. If the government was to distinguish between New Zealanders and Australians in its policies, I would think there's no real special reason to suspect, for anyone to suspect that Trump, I may have missed some huge thing, but I don't think he's ever made some big distinction between those. There's no, they're both countries that he probably thinks of as white, or, whereas in other cases, if Trump was to exclude all and only East Asian countries, then you'd start to think, well, you refer to the virus as the Chinese virus. So again, you have to look at the surrounding context. I also think a little bit more in the weeds that you need to sometimes look at the relationship between a particular group and the government, and what that relationship has been like historically. Of course, as surely anyone should know now, African Americans have very strong reasons to distrust the government. Very different, including security branches of the government, but all kinds of different parts of the government. Latinx people now, especially the Trump administration, have had a lot of bad interactions with the government. So all that kind of needs to be factored in. So it's not just, so in some, it's not just okay, the government's prohibiting this country, these folks from entering, and these folks. So is that, and I'm not sure, maybe that's a little arbitrary. Is that bad? You have to bring in all this surrounding context to figure out whether it's really problematic or not, and whether somebody could reasonably, from a particular group, could reasonably perceive that the government is motivated by, say, a stereotype of them that they are, inherently dirty or diseased or something like that.
Okay, so let's, so just a very recent development. I think it just happened last week. There was an order issued by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, or ICE, concerning F1 student visa holders. And ICE has ruled that student visa holders cannot stay in the United States on their current visa status if they are only taking online courses in the fall. And of course, many universities are planning to move their course offerings online, or have sort of conditional policies to do so. They might ultimately be forced to do so by local regulations as the response to the pandemic develops in the coming months. The president of Harvard University, Larry Burkow, recently issued a strongly worded statement in opposition to this ruling. So he wrote that the order came down without notice, its cruelty surpassed only by its recklessness. It appears it was designed purposefully to place pressure on colleges and universities to open their on-campus classrooms for in-person instruction in the fall without regard to concerns for health and safety of students, instructors, and others. So, I mean, there's a bunch of things to talk about here, but let's start with Burkow's suggestion that the immigration order was crafted to support other domestic policy goals of the present administration. So namely to motivate the reopening of universities in the fall. So we've already talked about how domestic policy considerations may legitimately figure in the construction of immigration policy. Is there anything in principle wrong with using immigration policy in the way that Burkow is suggesting here, in the way that ICE is doing it, to motivate other sort of policies?
I mean, I think this is a slightly abstract answer, but basically every immigration policy you implement changes the incentives of domestic actors in various ways. So there's no way to say like, oh, I'm going to just make immigration policy based on purely immigration considerations and not try to take in, the decisions you make about whether to let in more skilled or less skilled workers from here, they're all going to change the employment decisions of people and their own career choices. All of that's going to happen. So that's not kind of avoidable. The problem with this law is not that it changed people's incentives, but that it did so in this extremely cruel and damaging way, most damaging to the students themselves. And I had an F1 visa myself for many years, so but then also, I mean, I'm not a public health expert, but it seems obvious to me that different universities have very different choices to make about what's safe and not safe for their communities, and the idea that the Trump administration would try to force them all into this one pathway that's potentially very damaging to all members of their community, especially people with disabilities, people of color, and so on, who are especially at risk, just seems wrong. Kind of, I agree with everything that Burkow, is that how you pronounce his name? Burkow. Anyway, I agree with everything you said. I agree with everything.
Excellent.
I didn't think it was like philosophical. Yeah, not on very sophisticated philosophical. I think it was just, it was a rule that really has no benefits and enormous costs for particular people and for institutions and broader communities. So
yeah, good. And on that note, let's move on to the audience Q&A. So I'm going to pass things over to my colleague Simone Gubler, who will ask some questions from the audience. Thank you, Adam.
Okay, so we've had several questions from the audience, and I encourage people to keep sending them in. So the first question is from Parker, who has a question about international relations and the ways in which they condition immigration regulations. So Parker writes, is it permissible to have varying immigration regimes for countries that one has a special historical relationship with? And she gives us an example, the European Union and the Commonwealth. And then she writes, and should we view these as expressions of solidarity and admissions of integration, or do they function to consolidate imperial and racist histories?
It's a good question. That's a big question. There's a lot. I think, I do think that in the case of former colonies, that there's a good case for thinking that countries have obligations to admit people from those countries, so that the United Kingdom has had real obligations to admit people from, for example, the Caribbean, obligations that is massively violated recently by putting people under threat of deportation who were there for many years, from Jamaica and Trinidad and so on. So I don't know if that's an expression of solidarity, or I don't know how to describe it exactly. I think it's a recognition of historical injustice, and there are different ways to try to address it, but at least one is it shouldn't be that the only way you can access benefits from the United Kingdom in Jamaica is by migrating, but I think at least having the option is one. This is a much longer conversation, but I think there's a good case for reparations also for those countries. The EU is such a complicated case. I was opposed to say a very narrow thing. There was a view about Brexit that, well, the European Union is a kind of inherently imperialist project itself, and so it'd be better for the United Kingdom to leave. And that, at least, I was opposed to that view, because I thought, again, I think especially thinking about the context where so much of the argument for Brexit was caught up in a kind of ethno-nationalist sentiment, that for all the problems with the EU, I thought it's worse from the perspective of anti-racism and immigrant rights to be for Brexit than to be against it. But none of that is to insulate the European Union from criticism entirely. There's been a lot of very serious problems with the way that the border has been enforced for arrivals by sea from North Africa and so on. Those are all very serious problems that I wouldn't want to downplay.
So your reference to Brexit seems to have piqued some interest in our audience. We've got a couple of questions about Brexit that have just come in. Yeah. So the first one is from Maria, and she says, many people have characterized Brexit as a referendum on European immigration. Does the fact that the British people, rather than the Parliament, made the decision to adopt a more exclusionary relationship to citizens of neighbouring countries grant their decision greater legitimacy or make it relatively democratically robust?
Does the fact that it was passed through a referendum?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's always an issue with referenda that they sometimes they aren't always representative of what the average voter or thinks. They sometimes allow more extremist viewpoints to gain greater representation than they would through other processes of representation. So I'm a little skeptical of the argument that Brexit has this kind of like special democratic oomph because it was passed through a referendum rather than through parliamentary, purely parliamentary processes. I mean, I just think it has some. I think that's it's a democratic consideration. I don't think it's nothing, but I'm skeptical of. Some people want to say, well, look, the people spoke, and that's kind of it. So, and then I think it's also true that it's become very clear that there were a lot of issues that didn't come up during the initial Brexit debate that have, for example, to do with the Irish border, that was virtually non-discussed during the initial Brexit debate. That's obviously very serious issues. And so that too, I think, saps some of the democratic legitimacy out of the initial decision. If you think, well, people have seen that there's a lot of things that weren't taken into account, and now time has gone by, and so it's somewhat legitimate to revisit that decision. So that, I think that's part of the case for a second referendum, at least.
Great. So another question about skilled migration that also picks up the Brexit theme is from John, and he writes, some countries such as Canada and Australia have large immigrant communities, but strongly discriminate between skilled and unskilled migration. So certain Brexiteers claim that their goal is not to limit migration per se, but rather to refocus on skilled migration. On the one hand, John writes, this seems discriminatory. It seems to take an instrumentalizing attitude towards human migration that we might find ethically problematic. On the other hand, countries like Canada and Australia may have generally more positive attitudes towards immigration than countries with broader non-skills-based policies. So is discrimination on the basis of skills permissible or even commendable given these kind of pragmatic considerations?
Yeah, I mean, one point is the thing I said earlier, that I was very skeptical about the argument that said Brexit long-term is going to be kind of better for immigrants and better for people of color in the United Kingdom, given the surrounding context and Boris Johnson, it's not to be too partisan, but Boris Johnson is an openly racist person in my view. And so the fact that Brexit really brought him to power was, he said incredibly insulting things about Muslim women, about Black children, and so on. So I was very skeptical about that argument. But the general question is a very good question about skills-based distinctions. Are they really discriminatory in the way that other kinds of distinction might be. And on their face, they don't look discriminatory for some reasons, including the fact that they don't necessarily rely on some dehumanizing conception of the people that are who are being given less preference. It seems like the country is just saying, well, look, these folks would be more helpful to the labor market than these folks. It gets in practice a little more complicated than that. So one reason is that quote unquote skills-based, the reason I say quote unquote is that first of all, there's always a question about, well, what counts as a skill? And the way that countries determine who they consider to be skilled or useful ends up packing in a lot of assumptions. And one way in which that can be problematic is it's often quite gendered. Women often suffer under regimes that favor people who are considered more skilled because the kind of work they do is work that's not, even though I would say is in fact really quite important, like caregiving work is often not considered high skilled. And so in principle, that was a long answer, but in principle, I think, yeah, it's okay for a government to think, well, where are there gaps in the labor market and where aren't there? Do we need more doctors or more lawyers or something like that? That doesn't seem on its face like, preference for this ethnic group over this ethnic group or something like that. But in practice, the way that skills-based schemes have worked has sometimes had issues in defining who counts as skilled and in the impact that those decisions have had on groups that we would think of as wanting as having raising concerns about equality. So that was kind of
Great, thank you. So let's continue talking about skilled migration, although now in the American context. So Shannon has brought up the recent executive order issued by the US president that limits certain sorts of skilled migration into the United States. So I believe it affects people on H-1B, J-1, and L visas. And she writes that the order cites high unemployment rates in the domestic labor market driven by the pandemic as a rationale for excluding skilled workers that American businesses want to sponsor to come and work in the United States. Putting aside empirical considerations of whether this order will achieve that desired benefit to the workforce that's already present in the United States, she asks, do you think that protecting domestic labor from competition with international labor is a justifiable grounds for immigration restrictions?
So yeah, this does take us back to some of the things that we talked about earlier. So my first instinct when people raise this kinds of issue are again to say that we need to look at a slightly bigger picture than just, is this person interested in this particular job that they might be in competition with an immigrant for? Because you need to look at the overall impact on the economy of immigration. Does it expand public finances? Does it create new jobs that wouldn't have existed otherwise? Does it benefit consumers and all that kind of stuff? But if someone still says, well, like, is there in principle any justification? Is there any basis for the government to have some special response? Do governments have any kind of special responsibilities to their own domestic populations? I think there is a reasonable philosophical case for that. I just think that, as I've said, you can grant that and still be in favor of quite a lot of immigration. And I think that for not particularly distinctive reasons that I think governments exercise certain kinds of, they demand certain things from their own citizens that they don't demand from others. They demand obedience, they demand that they pay taxes, they demand those things. And so I think it is plausible to think that the government has certain responsibilities to those people that it doesn't, that the Canadian government owes some things to Canadians, members of Canadian society, that it doesn't owe to people in the United States. I think that is possible.
Okay, great. So that looks like we've come to the end of our audience questions. So I'm going to hand things back over to Ryan.
This concludes this week's PPE in a time of pandemic session. I just wanted to thank you, Adam, for joining us and talking to us about immigration. And I wanted to thank everyone in the audience for being here.